Good evening, everyone. My name is James Williams, and I am chair of the North Carolina Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System, or NCCRED. NCCRED is a nonpartisan nonprofit whose primary purpose is to identify and seek through collaborative action to address and remedy racial and ethnic disparities in our criminal and juvenile justice systems. Several years ago, in fact, about 4 years ago, NCCRED issued a resolution asking for the removal of Confederate monuments from court spaces across the state of North Carolina. We did this because we felt that Confederate monuments, particularly those situated in seats of justice, was inconsistent with the concept of equal justice under law. Last year, we decided that we would begin to plan a campaign to take further action to try to remove those monuments of oppression and hate. On February 14 of this year, we formally launched a campaign to remove Confederate monuments from court spaces. In the course of forming this campaign, we reached out to a number of like-minded organizations and individuals to partner with us in this campaign. One of the organizations that working with us in this effort is one of this country's premier civil rights organizations, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under the Law. NCCRED and the Lawyers Committee are co-sponsoring this webinar tonight, and I welcome you on behalf of both organizations and on behalf of other members of the campaign to remove Confederate monuments. I want to take a few minutes to do a brief introduction of our panelists this evening. I will start with our moderator. We have Commissioner Karen Howard. Ms. Howard is the chair of the Chatham County Board of County Commissioners. We are really pleased to have her as part of this conversation because she was chair of that commission a couple of years ago when there was activity to remove the Confederate monument that was located at the historic courthouse there in Pittsburgh, and that monument has since been removed. We also have as a panelist, Barrett Brown. Mr. Brown is the president of the Alamance County NAACP. There is a monument, Confederate monument located there in the county seat of Graham, again at a courthouse in downtown Graham. And Mr. Brown and the NAACP are active participants in an effort to have that monument removed. Welcome, Mr. Brown. We also have as a panelist, Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the Dean of the School of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities at Shaw University and is well versed in this issue as she is a member of a state commission related to these monuments. And finally, but not least, we have Mark Dorosin. Mark Dorosin is the managing attorney for Lawyers Committed for Civil Rights Under Law in this region. So without further ado, and in light of our limited time, I will turn it over to Commissioner Howard. We will have some time toward the end of the webinar for some Q&A. So if you have questions, you want to include those in the chat, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation that we are going to jump into, partly because it's such a topical issue across the nation, across the South, and certainly in North Carolina. And it's an issue that really is touching almost all of our communities across the state. But even more because of the panel of individuals that we have, we are going to get to hear an historical perspective, an activist's perspective, an attorney's perspective, and kind of bring that information together in ways that we hope is helpful for our audience in understanding the background of the issue, the challenges that are in our path, and kind of the opportunities that are in front of us to tell a better story, a more accurate story of North Carolina's history and the history of these monuments. So having said that, I would like to go to each of the panelists and ask you to speak maybe briefly a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this issue, but even more particularly about what you think your particular space and the issues that you can challenge in that space brings to the conversation. And I would love to start with you, Dr. Johnson. If you could talk a little bit about that perspective for all of us.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate being invited to participate in this panel. And I can start with my interest as a person interested in history. I am interdisciplinary in my approach, so I draw on the social sciences, the natural sciences, as well as arts and humanities to kind of think about these issues. And I've came to this particular issue concerning the Confederate monuments because of my tenure on the North Carolina State Historical Commission. And we were tasked with coming up with we were asked to provide guidance toward what to do about the monuments that were on the Capitol grounds, the monuments that are no longer there at this moment. But at the time in which we were asked to weigh in and to discuss the issue, several things had happened in this country. We had had Charlottesville. There was the action by Bree Newsom, and I'd like to come back to her a little bit later because of her connection with Shaw University, where she and other colleagues of hers brought down a Confederate flag. The response to that from state legislatures all over the South was to try to protect what they considered history, and that history in terms of Confederate flags and Confederate monuments. Well, part of the reason I'm interested is because we don't talk about the full history of these monuments, these flags. We get caught up in the emotion of what has happened. But if you look at if you read scholars and listen to people who have really done deep studying about these monuments, and I have to include the Confederate flag, you'll know that they were symbols of white supremacy and oppression. And they were always designed to be so. They were to stake a claim for an idea around the suppression of Black peoples, African peoples in the United States and what was then the United States. It was also about claiming a sovereignty that would allow the ownership of human beings, that you could create a state where, or a series of states, where you could own people and that it would be sanctioned and it would be okay. And so these symbols, like people, I kind of chuckle a little bit when I look at the various Confederate battle flags and understand, and it will take more learned scholars than myself to unpack them, but most of them are not even the flags that were flown over the various Confederate states. They were battle flags that were used. They symbolized different constituencies. And so people don't always know even what particular flag is associated with what particular community. Jumping into the Reconstruction era was when we got these Confederate monuments, most of them. And they were designed to inspire terror, though the surface reason for these monuments was to celebrate the lost cause and to venerate those young soldiers and those men who, and some women who fought for the Southern states. But in fact, they came several years after the end of the Civil War, and they were erected in order to remind uppity Black folks that you did not have political power, that you did not have a stake in this democracy, that you needed to be quiet and stay in your place. And if you didn't, you were going to be dealt with harshly. And part of that harshness was in terms of lynching. So that's why I became interested in understanding that fuller history and brought that to bear when it came time for us to discuss what to do about those monuments on public lands, where our tax dollars were helping to pay for the maintenance and preservation of these odes to terror, as I call them. So I'll stop here because I have want to hear from the other panelists, but that is just a little overview of where I come to this discussion.
Thank you. And I think that's such an important part of the background. Barrett, I'm going to come to you next because I'm interested in hearing how maybe the activist role has sort of picked up on that backstory and is kind of retelling the story of the Confederate monuments, the Confederate flags, in a way that challenges the notion of the uppity Black folk, that this is really all people of color, many demographics that are standing with us. And I'd like to hear a little bit about your perspective in this issue.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for inviting me to say a little something about this cause that we have in Alamance County, which has picked up traction across the state and across the country. We first became aware, well, let me say we've always known that the monuments were there, but because racism is so systematic and so sly, it had become such a part of the fabric of the community that it was just something that was accepted. I think if you travel anywhere in North Carolina, you will not go to many county seats that do not have a Confederate monument or have had a Confederate monument in front of them. Usually they're facing north and they're armed. And when it first became a problem here, a friend of mine who runs another organization called Concerned Citizens called me and said, Barrett, don't you think it's time for these Confederate monuments to come down? And I said, well, I think that is something we should definitely talk about, but I don't want to do that at the expense of talking about policies and budgets and things that affect people on a day-to-day basis. And it seemed largely symbolic to me. And but I did agree to kind of talk to our legislators about removing it. Well, actually, our county commissioners about moving it. While we were having a conversation, the mayor of Graham, where our monument is situated, because that's the county seat, we talked about it, and he said, Barrett, I know exactly where we can move it. We've got a battlefield, we've got an old cemetery, and we were beginning to have discussions about relocating the monument to somewhere a more historical, with a historical context. And while we were doing that, the legislature voted to remove the monuments from the auspices of local municipalities, which seemed to me a gross overreach in the state's authority. But then we started to talk about, well, I called the Historical Association to figure out how we would file paperwork to get it removed and to request. And then I found out it had to be brought up by our delegation. I was told a member of our no kind of legislative delegation would have to introduce, and it'd have to come before the legislature. And I knew that was going to be a hard slog because at the time, none of our local legislators were in favor of moving it. In fact, one of our legislators had a picture of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in his office in the legislature. So I knew that was going to be a hard slog. And but the turning point for me really was, for me personally, was I go to a church where I am, I'm one of the few African Americans in that congregation, and people who had heard the same litanies that I had heard the same sermons, and people I worshiped with and who I believe love me and I love them, were saying to me, well, Barrett, it's such a shame about that monument, but you know, it is part of our legacy. It is part of our history. It is part of our culture. And that is the first time I understood that well-meaning people were fooled and cajoled into supporting the kind of mysticism around the antebellum South, and they weren't telling the full truth. And so what we have, the Alamance branch of the NAACP has taken up this cause as a condition of coming together. In order to have some reconciliation, we're gonna have to have some truth. And so that we're gonna have to tell the truth about what happened. And she was chair of the county commissioners at the time, asked, well, when people started getting arrested around the monument, and it seemed like people were being more vocal in the streets about removing it. Amy Gailey, who's now in the legislature, said to me, well, Barrett, what can we do? And I said, well, white folks can start telling the truth. And I said, that will put us in a framework for becoming more restorative as a community. And so we have been making the case that that monument should be removed. Well, in response to the removal of that monument, the city, the town of Graham, the county commissioners, first of all, they tried to play hot potato about who it belonged to, because there's some monuments have been removed because the people who own them were okay with removing them. So some discussion about whether it belonged to the county or whether it belonged to the town, or who was supposed to protect it. And while this was going on, I think a monument came down in Durham. I think some activists pulled it down. And in a response to that, our sheriff posted a 24-hour guard around the monument and put cameras on it. And whenever we're out protesting it, there are rifled officers on the roof. And then they put live guards out around it 24 hours. And then I was out protesting it, and I was arrested along with 3 other members of the NAACP. And then after we were arrested and charged with impeding traffic and resisting arrest, they put a fence around it. And so what we have maintained is that there is a provision in the law that says if a monument is a threat to public safety, that it can be removed by local municipalities. And we maintain that anything that has to be monitored 24 hours, that the armed guards have to monitor it, and they have to put a fence around it, and that people get arrested around it, and people have been pepper sprayed around it, and you've had to instill curfews to keep people from protesting around, that is the very definition of a threat to public safety, not to be removed on its face. Not to mention the fact that it is at heart a totem to white supremacy. And I've said over and over again, if it was in a museum, if it was on a battlefield, if it was in a historic cemetery, if the mayor of Graham wanted to put it right in the middle of his yard on private property, I would not object to that. But to have it stand right in the place where symbolically all the citizens of Alamance County have to come and have justice meted out to them is inappropriate. And we have not, there have been some discussions about putting it in context, and what if we put up an African-American monument near it, or what if we put up some signage around it? And it's been our position that we want that monument removed, and that any attempt to put it in context without removing it, we would consider that capitulation, and we're not going to do that. So we have made redress to our local elected officials, to our legislators, to our delegations. We've taken direct action, and now we are prepared to go to the courts and sue for the removal of that discriminatory public display of white supremacy.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue to you, Mark, because it is not as simple as having the conversations and the community largely saying we're in favor of removal to a more appropriate location or contextualizing. There are significant legal challenges and hurdles to overcome. And I'm inviting you to now speak with us about those and maybe clarify for us some of the impediments that communities have faced.
Sure, thank you, and thank you. It's an honor to be here today and to be sharing the Zoom stage with such wonderful friends and inspiring colleagues, Dr. Johnson, my friend Barrett Brown, James Williams, and of course, Commissioner Yu, my commissioner colleague, Commissioner Howard. Both Dr. Johnson and Barrett gave a great introduction to sort of this question about the legal context in which this happens. And just, Barrett and Dr. Johnson both alluded to these actions to protect these monuments that came about. And it's worth noting in North Carolina, so what happened in North Carolina, well, everyone remembers the tragic murders of 9 Black parishioners at a church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. And in many ways that restarted the debate about these monuments and these symbols. As Barrett pointed out, the debate's been going on for a much longer time than that, but that incident brought it back to the public, to a broader public consciousness. And in South Carolina, where it happened, there were discussions about removing the flag. But in North Carolina, the General Assembly went in the exact opposite direction. And just barely a month after the Charleston massacre, the legislature passed and Governor McCrory signed a bill officially called the Cultural History, Artifact Management and Patriotism Act, but we know it colloquially as the Monument Protection Act. And it was clearly designed to protect these Confederate monuments. It doesn't say that in the statute, but it is clearly designed to do that. And what that does, as Barrett said, it took away or it purports to take away control from local governments, the ability to regulate the placement, maintenance, or location of these monuments. And as Barrett and Dr. Johnson both pointed out, are typically on public property, most typically at the county courthouse, the place that is supposed to symbolize justice in many counties, in Alamance, and I know in Chatham, it's also often a site where the local government meets. The county commissioners have their meetings. And so this statute was passed in the wake of the Charleston massacre. And then, it's an interesting statute. There's some particular issues with it, and what it does really creates some real critical factual questions for any community that's looking at at trying to remove these symbols of hate. One of the provisions of the statute that's real critical is that it applies only to monuments that are owned by the state. And so in some cases, as was the case in Chatham County, for example, a review of the historical record shows, in fact, that the monuments are not owned by the state. They are owned by private properties who had, back in 1905 or 1910, which is when all these monuments were going up, and Dr. Johnson, I'm sure, will tell us more about that, in that era of Jim Crow. Many of these counties and local governments made agreements with groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy to give them permission to put the monument on public property. And so in counties and cities where that's been the case, the Monument Protection Act doesn't apply. The monuments are privately owned, and so they can be removed. Similarly, in Winston-Salem, there was a case where a monument was removed. In that case, the monument had been on the historic courthouse grounds for decades, but the county and city sold that historic property to a private nonprofit. And so the monument was no longer on state property. It was on private property at that point and could be removed. So initially there are some, I don't want to say loopholes, but there are some exemptions in the statute as to when it applies. And so for any community that's organizing around removing the monument, one of the first things to really try to find out is the historical record. And Barrett pointed out, who owned the monument and whose it is becomes an issue. One of the other provisions of the act that is interesting is the one also that Barrett mentioned, this public safety exception. So there is language in the statute that says that that if the monument presents a public safety hazard, if it is dangerous or presents a threat to public safety, that it could be removed. And it's certainly, for a long time, but certainly in the wake of the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 2017, these monuments have once again become the centerpiece of protests and counter protests, focus for anti-racist protesters, but also for neo-Confederate white supremacists who want to defend these statutes. And so in lots of communities, these statutes, these monuments have become a real focal point for protests. Local governments are spending serious amounts of money to try to protect them or to have to protect them or to keep anybody from getting hurt. And so there is clearly a public safety issue regarding these monuments, which is another provision of the statute that is critical for local governments and communities to consider when they're dealing with it. I'll say quickly just two other things about the Monument Protection Act that I just is a little more legalistic, but worth just talking about for our conversation is, we have some questions as to whether the act should even apply to Confederate monuments, because there is these monuments honor the Confederacy, which was organized in and engaged in treason against the United States of America by fighting that Civil War. These monuments glorify what was an unconstitutional rebellion against the United States, and for the particular purpose of retaining race-based chattel slavery. When our North Carolina Constitution has language in it, was required to be added as a condition of getting back into the Union after the Civil War, that says that secession is forever prohibited, and that any attempts to dissolve the Union or sever this nation shall be resisted with the power of the state. That's Article 1, Section 4. And Article 1, Section 5, and these are right in the Declaration of Rights in the North Carolina Constitution, says that every citizen of this state owes paramount allegiance to the Constitution and the government of the United States. And so we believe a legal argument can be made that those provisions, along with other language that was added to the North Carolina Constitution in 1868, abolishing slavery, guaranteeing Black men the right to vote, that those provisions make it unconstitutional to continue to protect these Confederate monuments. And I can talk more about some other constitutional issues, but when you come back around.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Because I do want, our time is limited, but I would like to ask each of you to speak for 3 minutes about where do you go from here in your space? Is this an inflection point? Is there something happening across the nation that could be a catalyst for real change? And there are things that can happen in each of these spaces, in the legal, in the activist space, in the educational and historical. And is there something what do you see happening next in your realm? Sorry, and I'll go in the same order. I'll have Valerie and then go to Barrett and finish with Mark, please.
Well, I can say right off the bat, one of the things that Barrett mentioned that is really, to me, important is this idea of truth telling and of having, before we can move forward, we're going to have to own up to the historical truths. That means telling the whole story, having all the narratives be a part of what we promote educationally. So we, excuse me. So part of the challenge, though, is in our educational system, the resistance that we have to telling historical fact in our textbooks with our children, being able to have conversation about what happened and why is this important. It's important to know that the United Daughters of the Confederacy were a key factor in erecting all of these Confederate monuments and all in the 100 different counties. That each county in the state of North Carolina had some sort of Confederate monument. And again, what does that speak to? It speaks to the fact that traitors, those who were insurrectionists who fought against the sitting government, are being valorized. And that is problematic. And if we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of continuing to support fascist actions, we need to be able to talk about it. So when you ask me, what is it that I want to do? I want to have multiple level conversations. Part of it comes from my work on the Historical Commission when those issues are raised. Part of it is with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, which I chair and has stewardship over our heritage spaces and culture and history of African Americans in North Carolina. We also need it's not just about looking backward to the past and that kind of history, but it is, how is this playing out right now, this minute, in this particular moment where I'm still processing what has happened with the George Floyd, with the trial against Chauvin and the aftermath of that trial, which is, I cannot say that it is exactly a turning point. It is an important moment, but how long is this moment going to be able to last? And thinking about all the different kind of moments that we've had where we have been able to where as a country, we've been making choices to continue to keep peoples of color, and I pluralize that on purpose, subjugated or disenfranchised or not getting equitable access to healthcare, economics, and other things that are important. So that's where I am now, helping my students to be galvanized around this discussion, working through our center. I'm co-director also of our Center for Racial and Social Justice. So this is exactly the moment in which we need to have more than conversation, but also point to the kinds of actions like they're taking in Alamance County and have to take across to resist what I would say complacency, to resist just going along to get along, but to really do what's necessary to bring truth and reconciliation to our people.
Thank you. And then Barrett, same question. Where do you go from here?
Well, we have a core goal of eliminating racism. So we are constantly working through various committees to untangle systematic racism as we find it in our neck of the woods in Alamance County. And if we can partner with other branches or organizations across the state or the community, we will do that. We are hoping to get this, we are planning to have this monument removed. What I sincerely believe is that one of the problems that why racism and social prejudice and white supremacy persists in this country is because we've never had to have a conversation about repentance and about reconciliation. In South Africa, they had an imperative to have truth and reconciliation. They had truth and reconciliation commissions, and they had to do that white people had a vested interest in that because they were outnumbered. So they did not want the streets to run red with the blood of white folks because Black people were angry and had that tension pent up. So people told the truth. And because white people told the truth, unmarked graves were found, and people had the remains of their loved ones returned to them. And people were able to tell the truth about their experience, and they felt heard, and they were able to move forward toward a path of reconciliation. We have not had to do that because white people outnumbered Black people vastly across the country. There were places, of course, like Mississippi, Alabama, where Black people outnumbered the white people, and you see how brutal the white people in power were in maintaining their sense of privilege. So what I maintain is that we've got to have these conversations so that we can heal, so that we can become a community, and that we've got to just tell the truth about what slavery was, about what white supremacy was, and how you can benefit from white privilege without even knowing it. It's so ingrained in our community, but we can't have those conversations if people aren't willing to tell the truth. And we have to confront each other about it, and we're doing that when we go out and march, and when we go take direct action, and when we have conversations in the halls of power and the sheriff's offices and the county commissioner's offices. Wherever we go, our mission is to speak truth to power and to stand flat-footed and declare that everybody ought to be treated equally. And we have been doing that in Alamance County with a very broad delegation of people who are members of this organization. We have one of the most, I dare say, one of the most diverse NAACP branches in the state. And so it's not just Black people saying, we want to be treated equally, that this is unfair. It is that white people are as outraged as we, as Black people are, and Native American people are outraged. And that anybody, we make the case that if you love the United States and you want this to be a more perfect and a freer union, then you are obligated to object to this monument and anything that would divide the country. I've yet to figure out how anybody can support the troops and be a patriot and a Confederate at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, Mark, I will go to you and ask, where do we go from here in a legal sense? What next?
It's so inspiring to be a part of this panel, and just love everything that Barrett was saying. And I think this is exactly right. This whole aspect of truth telling. I think we are in an inflection point or a critical moment. I think after the Charlottesville in 2017, and the murder of George Floyd, the whole country's consciousness was forced to if not reconcile, at least face the kind of truth that Barrett was talking about. And just in the context of these monuments, I mean, even though there's been this Monument Protection Act, we've seen local governments across the state following activism from citizen groups and leadership from local governments take these monuments down in places like Anson County, Chatham, Pitt County, Vance, Granville, Warren, as well as, cities, Fayetteville, Rocky Mount, Wilmington, Salisbury, Lewisburg, places, despite that act where residents demanded and local governments understood that these monuments are symbols of racial hate, and that their presence has a racially discriminatory impact. And so that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens with, the kind of, public pressure that Barrett and other community activists have done, going to county meetings, educating other members in their community about these monuments, their history, what Valerie does, and really, really pulling back the curtain on, the real history of these monuments, why they were installed, when they were installed, what their intent was. It was to continue to support a system, Jim Crow at the time, but a system of white supremacy and Black subordination. And the idea that because that happened a long time ago, that's not what those monuments still do and represent is is not the truth that like Barrett was talking about. So I think we are really at a critical moment. And I think, you know, and as Valerie said, the verdict today is, for which I'm so grateful, is further evidence, I hope, that we're really beginning this kind of, you know, truth and reconciliation that Barrett described.
I agree, and I hope so. We have a couple of questions in the question section. I'm going to get to that in 1 second, but I just do want to say before, you know, we end, how deeply grateful I am for each of you and for the work that you are doing in your various domains. I know that there must be so many times that it feels we're just chipping away at this system of white supremacy and systemic racism. And we are chipping away at it, but we are chipping away at the very base and the foundation of it. And the entire thing will crumble when we've done enough chipping. And I think we are certainly heading that way. And as the mother of 5 young Black men, I am daily deeply grateful for folks like you and the work that you are doing. So let us just quickly go to the Q&A. And I think some of these are best suited to particular individuals. And the first question was about a comment on the monument removal statute. And I hope we've already answered that, because I think that might have been pre-Mark's comments. But the next one is, for those counties that have had monuments removed, did they address the Monument Protection Act? And if so, how did they address it? Mark, I think that's probably a good one for you.
Sure. Well, I can say, for example, in Chatham County, and let me also just start by giving props to you, Karen. The commissioners there took a very bold stand, and having been involved in that, you know, you talked about chipping away, and no one should come away with the false idea that that's an easy thing to do. The pressures on the community are great, and the pressures that the commissioners were under, I know, was significant. And so, you know, in the Chatham case, which we were involved in on behalf of the NAACP and a community group called Chatham for All, the Daughters of the Confederacy did file a lawsuit. They tried to say that the county couldn't take it down because of the Monument Protection Act. And the argument that was made, and which ultimately prevailed, was, again, went to this question of ownership, and that is that the monument in Chatham wasn't owned by the state. It still belonged to the Daughters of the Confederacy, so the county was within its rights to say, we don't want it here anymore, come and take it away. And if you don't, we'll take it down and we'll put it in storage for you until you come and get it. Similarly, in Winston-Salem, there was the same kind of thing. The monument was no longer on public property. The city, there was public safety issues, the kind like Barrett described. The city said, we want it to be taken down, and if you don't take it down, we'll take it down for you. So the act is always an issue. I will tell you that both the Winston-Salem case and the Chatham case have been appealed. The Winston-Salem case is now at the Supreme Court of North Carolina. The Chatham case is at the Court of Appeals. And so, you know, I think we're going to be getting some decisions from the court that will help hopefully clarify the scope of that act. But it is always a consideration. But I will also say, in lots of other places where local governments, city or county, have voted to move the monument or take it down, there have not been the challenge. That they've been, you know, as Barrett said, they've been relocated to a cemetery in one case, to other private property, and the local government stood strong.
Thank you. There's also a question of the Montgomery County has a Confederate monument located on the outside of the courthouse in Troy, North Carolina, but it's not listed on the campaign to remove North Carolina's Confederate Monuments website. And the question is, how can we get this monument added to the list? And I think maybe James would best speak to that.
Thank you, Karen. I'm happy to speak to that. Certainly, we will look into that. If it's in a courtyard space or near courthouse and is not on our list, then it should be. And while I can't answer why it is not listed now, we will I'll look at that tomorrow and try to find out. It will be added if it is a monument and it is on a courtyard space or in a courtyard space. So thank you for alerting whoever it was that alerted us to that. Thank you so much.
So there is a question about Person County and not having removed its monument. I think that might be a little broad for the few moments that we have left, but if we can get to that at the end, I'll come back around. The Attorney General seems to have a hands-off approach. Couldn't he help us in ways? That's the question. And I guess maybe the lawyers could speak to that, but yeah, I'll let the lawyers speak.
I've not had conversations with the Attorney General on this issue. I do know that at some level, the Attorney General, I think, is expected to defend the laws of the state of North Carolina. So there may be a bit of a conflict here, but Mark, in terms of if he were to take the position against the monuments law, but Mark may have some further thoughts about that.
It would be great if the Attorney General would weigh into this discussion. I think about, I think that there's a lot of folks wanting the Attorney General to get more engaged on the issue of racial justice and racial equity. There was just a commission that came out with a list of recommendations to address racial inequities in the criminal justice system. I think it's worth us putting pressure on him to do that. As you pointed out, Karen or James in the beginning, most of these monuments are in front of courthouses. They send a clear message about the likelihood of getting justice inside one of those buildings. So I'd love to see him weigh in.
Yeah, I agree. That placement is not accidental. Okay, there's another question. This one's for you, Barrett. How did you persuade the community not to consider the option of building a monument to honor notable Blacks? It seems that this is often thrown around as an option to appease the local community instead of removing the monument.
So I welcome a monument to local Blacks, but I wanted them to be clear that it was not a compromise. They put one up. In fact, what I said was, if they put up a statue of Wyatt Outlaw, who was lynched in Alamance County, or Frederick Douglass, then they could put one up 6 feet tall. That Confederate monument still was going to have to come down. Like, we're not going to capitulate by taking some kind of substitute.
Thank you.
And I'd like to just add to that it does come up all the time. It came up in our deliberations around the monuments on the state capitol grounds, that you could contextualize those Confederate monuments by putting up something depicting Native Americans and African Americans. But these are different kinds of conversations. And the other thing I want to say about the monuments is that the workmanship is not always that great, as you can see how easy it is to bring them down, that they're not well made. They don't even have that aesthetic quality to them. So it tells me that they were erected in order to serve a different kind of purpose, not an aesthetic purpose, and not even really a lasting monumental purpose in the sense of our great monuments that have this permanency. It is a different kind of permanency that gets into your system and that causes you to be engaged in internal oppression. And that's the part that we're fighting against as well.
And also it's a false equivalency. I mean, exactly. to suggest that, we'll just put up a Black one is literally a whitewash of the Confederate legacy. If you put up Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or any African American, you're still putting up a statue of an American citizen who was trying to make the Union better, and not a traitor who took up arms against the Union.
Exactly. So there's a question in the chat that I just wanted to quickly, is there any way to research and determine ownership? Any easy way? I'm going to jump in and say, no, there's not an easy one, but I will leave that again to the James and Mark. And
so that's a good question. And one of the things There is in the chat a link to our monuments removal website. One of the things that we wanted to do as a part of this campaign is to be a resource to people within communities who are engaged in efforts or who are thinking about engaging in efforts to remove monuments. And we've been fortunate. We have 6 or 7 excellent historians who are partnering with us in that effort. So, while, in some communities, people have, people on the staff of the county commissioners and others who might be able to do that research. In other communities that are not as well resourced, it may be a challenge. And so if you're in one of those communities and you need some additional assistance, contact me or send an email to NCCred, and we can follow up on trying to get you some assistance. And a related question, Karen, is on this issue of, is there any free legal assistance to citizens seeking to remove Confederate monuments? And, I need to be careful in terms of how I respond to that. I will say that I'm aware, and there are lawyers who are supporting this effort who I think might be willing to assist in giving some guidance, in this issue. There are 6 or 7 attorneys that are a part of this effort. So here again, if you're in a community and you think you could benefit from some legal guidance and assistance, if you reach out, we can try to connect you with some legal resources in that area. And Mark, you may want to speak to that issue also.
I was going to say the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has we're the North Carolina Regional Office with my colleague Elizabeth Haddix and I. And this monument work is a core element of our mission. So we'd be happy to talk with any folks in any communities that are looking for legal assistance. And I'll put my email in the chat, and you could also find us on the web.
And if I could do a commercial for the Lawyers Committee, we were originally protesting in Alamance County, and the response to our protest about the monument was that they put the town under martial law, and they refused to issue permits to peaceably assemble. And I was so shook. I told the lawyer, I don't even know what a injunction is, but we need an injunction and sue everybody until they figure out who violated our civil rights. And when the Lawyers Committee looked into it, we realized that we had been operating under an unconstitutional permitting ordinance for 30 or 40 years. I mean, we hadn't even noticed it. And they ended up at the very next town council getting rid of the entire ordinance. So, and I'm very grateful to the work that the Lawyers Committee is doing in Alamance County.
And I will do a quick plug for your local NAACPs. Those are excellent allies, and in Chatham County, they joined in with us. I do think it would be helpful if maybe we could talk for just a couple of seconds. There was one comment that said, how do you convince a racist to become accountable? And we in Chatham, we actually started with many months of commissioners listening in to the community and listening to a lot of, what were considered some diehard racists, but also hearing a lot of people come out and say, this wasn't the story I'd heard. I didn't know this. I never understood my history to be this way. I was one of those people like you, Barrett, that didn't really notice the monument at first. And it took other people talking to me about what it meant. And it's the backstory. I had never heard of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I didn't grow up in the United States. And so for me, all of this was such new learning. And I realized that there were other people, other people who shared my ignorance, and they were hanging on to that ignorance as part of their identity. Mm-hmm. If they heard the truth, they might be willing to sleep on it, chew on it, hear it from someone else who looked like them and maybe change their minds. And so, I'll say that's my 2 cents on how you can possibly, potentially, in some cases, get a racist to listen.
What we do in Alamance County, we're very intentional about this with the NAACP, is that we believe that even people we vehemently disagree with are brothers and sisters who are in error. And so we're not looking to make enemies, we're looking to bring them along. And education and a conversation goes a long way. It's much more beneficial to have a conversation about why they believe what they believe than it is to just swear at them and, and call them names.
And let me just add that a good model for here in the United States that was based on the Truth and Reconciliation activity in South Africa is in Greensboro, and the beloved community with Nelson and Joyce Johnson, where they have a model for how it is that you have these difficult conversations across so many differences. And so I would suggest that you look into that that particular model. And it's the Truth and Reconciliation. It was at the end, in Greensboro, and that to me is a great source.
Karen, if I could, I might reiterate something that you just said, and that is related to the local NAACP branches. Of the 10 or 11 efforts that I am aware of, and then several others that have already been successful, but I'm thinking of the current efforts right now. In practically every one of them, the local NAACP branch is a big part of the effort to try to get those monuments removed. And so they are a critical ally in this effort.
Absolutely. So we're at 8 o'clock. There is one question about if you do not have an NAACP chapter, who would you suggest? And Barrett, I'll let you answer that, but I also know that there's, you can reach out beyond your community's NAACP. Yeah. So Barrett, if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, neighboring branches are always helpful. There's one in practically every county. I would also suggest that whatever, there's usually a church or a Greek letter organization or an HBC if you have one in your community, or just a group of friends. I know that I used to live in Durham, and there used to be a group of people who would go to county commission meetings and city council meetings, and they call it sweating them. Just go sit in the room. Even if you don't have a question, just be present, because if they think that we're not paying attention, they're liable to try anything. And if what they think is true, they're liable to get away with. So I would say just whatever your bridge club or your family, a brother or sister, you don't need a lot of people. You just need, to go and speak truth to power and walk down to the front of the at public hearing and
I'm losing Barrett, but James, if you wanted to tie up the loose ends.
Just go down to the front of a meeting at a county commission meeting, a community city council meeting, and just go to the microphone and make a request.
Agreed.
You don't need to look for big numbers.
All right.
Thank you. Well, I want to first of all thank our moderator and our panelists for just doing an excellent job in informing. So much of this effort is an educational effort. And by that, I mean not just education in getting the history right, because that is clearly an important aspect of trying to get these monuments removed. But I mean education in a different sense in terms of people helping people, communities helping communities, learning from the experience of one community on how another community can go about doing this work, forming those relationships, collaborating. And so, I think these webinars, are a good way to help continue doing that. And so I just really feel good about tonight's event, not just from the standpoint of the presentations themselves, but from the excellent questions and feedback that we're getting from people who are attending. And so thank you so much. I know we said we were going to end at 7, and we are a little past 7. And we're going to continue doing this work. This campaign realizes that this is a marathon and not a sprint. But we think as we gain momentum and energy, we're going to see some change. We're going to be the change that we want to see in this state as it relates to this issue. And this issue is so connected because it's a part of the truth telling. It's a part of the transformation of society. And so it is something that we should do, something that we must do. So again, on behalf of our campaign and our sponsoring organizations, thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next episode. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Great to see everyone.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much.